but I will stay in touch with him for sure. I'm always looking for people who are kind of like generating story as they move through life. And I had a glimpse of maybe another story.
Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is the best-selling author, Michael Lewis. I hope you enjoy. Well, Michael Lewis, thank you so much for joining me. It's so great to see you again. Michael Lewis, of course, a best-selling author, one of the gifted storytellers of our time, author of such books as Liar's Poker, Moneyball, The Big Short, Flash Boys, The Undoing Project. His latest is Going Infinite, The Rise and Fall of a New Tycoon. Michael Lewis, welcome. It's great to speak with you.
Good to see you, Peter.
Yeah, always is. Thank you. Well, Michael, I wanted to, first of all, congratulations on your latest book, which, if I read correctly, is actually the fastest selling book of all of yours, at least for this at this stage of the game. It seems like it's being gobbled up with alacrity.
Yes.
And already the rights, even before publication, were sold to Hollywood. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about, in past conversations, you have talked about the role with me and with others that luck plays in the books that you write. And I
you picked a good one to talk about.
Exactly.
Yeah,
As I was reading the book, I couldn't believe how fortunate you were to have found a subject and then to ensconce yourself with that subject at the point at which it went from top of the mountain to the mountain crumbling.
Right.
Talk a little bit about your process of coming to Sam Bankman-Fried, or actually rather his coming to you, to Berkeley.
Yeah, that's right. So it's totally, there's a huge amount of accident in this story. I'm trying to give myself a little credit beyond just the luck here. I'm trying to say, like, what did I do right? Because I'm not quite sure there's that much, but there's a little bit. I wasn't interested in crypto as a subject, really. I'd kind of waded into it a couple times, and the technology didn't interest me that much. It's just a technology story. The characters I had encountered up to that point in crypto, before I met Sam Bankman-Fried, all felt like they were selling me something, and they all wanted me to write about them. And I don't respond very well to that. It's sort of like,
so it's a market for them, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And what happened in his case was a friend of mine, main character Flash Boys, Brad Katsuyama, called me up and said he was in this was September of 2021. He was in this odd situation of about to be doing a business deal. I mean, it was middle of COVID, so this partly explains it, with a guy with Sam Bankman-Fried, who he'd only just come to know, felt he didn't really know him that well, felt that they were going to exchange $300 million in shares in each other's company, and he couldn't find even like character references. And no wonder no one knew who Sam Bankman-Fried was 18 months earlier, and he'd gone from that to being worth maybe the richest person in the world under 30. But he was in Hong Kong. So Brad said, could you just meet with him and talk to him and just give me your view, what you think of him, any red flags kind of thing. And so Sam Bankman-Fried, I didn't know who he was, never heard of him. The idea of him did interest me, though, for this reason. When crypto started, when I started to kind of think maybe crypto had some use for me, when it exploded, when it went from, at that point it was at a market cap of $2 trillion. And I was really interested in kind of the socially disruptive side of it, like having people came out of nowhere, like Sam Bankman-Fried, and all of a sudden they've got a pile of $20 billion and they're doing things with it and changing the world with it. So I was interested in him when I learned of his existence, when he rolled in. I spent 2 hours with him, gave maybe the single worst piece of investment advice I've ever given. I told my friend, I said, what could go wrong? Go ahead and do your deal. But by then I was off his interest and onto mine, because Sam, over 2 hours, and Sam had no particular interest in me like writing about him. It was like, he knew he was there because Brad wanted me to get to know him so I could talk to Brad. But after 2 hours, I thought, this person is having such an unusual experience. He's interesting. Everything that's coming out of his mouth is kind of interesting. And the world seems to have organized itself very fast around this new fortune. He was in the middle of him. He had his fingerprints all over American politics. He was learning all these things about how to essentially manipulate the media. It was one thing after another. And I just thought, I said to him, I just want to watch. So I didn't know what story I was going to tell. I just wanted to watch. And this is how the books usually start. I just kind of want to hang out. Let me come hang out for a few months. And I spent a year going back and forth to the Bahamas, traveling with him, trying to figure out what the story was, and gathered material but didn't actually have a book. So this is where the luck comes in. I've had this happen to me before where I've spent a year on something and it came to nothing. Like I just walked away from the project. And I was on the cusp of doing that, not because I had any great suspicions of Sam Bankman-Fried. It wasn't that. It was just that as a story, it didn't go anywhere. It was, I had a beginning and a middle kind of thing, but I didn't have an end. And I was very aware I didn't have an end. And I was talking to my publisher about this, talking to friends about this, just kind of like grappling with, I have this character who has the dimensions of a great literary character, the complexity, the shading, all this. I have a lot of situations, scenes that are going to be fun to paint, but I got nowhere for the story to go. The day before the FTX collapse, the day before, so it starts unwinding on a kind of a Sunday. Can't remember the exact date. Call it like the 5th of November, around then. The Saturday, I was sitting with a friend who was a film director, telling him I had this problem. I'd spent a year gathering this stuff and didn't know if I had a book. And he said to me, he said, you have a book. He said, you just don't have a movie. You don't have a movie because you don't have an ending. You don't have an act. You don't have a third act. He said, but you could he said, basically, you could trick the reader. That the stuff is so good that you could contrive some phony ending and nobody will blame you. You can kind of dance your way out of that. And that was on my mind when I was thinking, maybe I can do that. Maybe I'll find some tricky way to do this book. But I wasn't all in. And then it falls apart. So I stumbled into it, or it stumbled into me. I did not have a theory of the case. All I had was lots of observations and characters and color. And then this happens. I think I probably said this to you before, but with book material especially, you want to be in a situation where you're only constrained by your abilities. It isn't the material that's constraining you. Like with Flash Boys, I was constrained by the material. I had a main character who had nothing wrong with him. He was like a nice Canadian guy. That sucks as a character. It's just a problem. And I was aware there was a limit to what I could do with him. I loved him as a person, but as a character, he was like, I couldn't find dimensions to him that to make him kind of leap in the way of a literary character who wants to leap off the page. With this material, it was like just a question of how good am I? Because the material was that good. And unconstrained by anything but my own abilities. I know it's a tragedy and I'm supposed to be miserable and all that, but I had so much fun writing this book. It was just like a gas to write.
Wow. Well, you mentioned that he didn't really have any interest in you, that he was hoping to get the next conversation with Brad Katsuyama. But why then did he allow you such access? Well, this is the most remarkable thing, that you had spent so much time, you were in the room as he's talking to business leaders, politicians, you're on flights with him. Like, why would he give you that access?
So I always ask that question. I mean, because from every subject, I'm asking for that kind of access. So they have to have a reason why they give it to me. And typically what happens is I'm not asking for, it's a first date. You don't ask, you don't even try to kiss him on the first date. You just take him out to dinner. And but it takes a little while before you get to the point where you're really embedded with them. And that happened with him like it happened with everybody else. But why the initial willingness to let me just come and loiter? One was, he was a bit of a media whore already. Like, it was just like he was talking to anybody who called him. And he was not making distinctions within the media much. There was no great strategy. It was like, we'll just talk to everybody and get as much attention as possible. So he was already predisposed to talk to people, but mostly people weren't asking for what I was asking for. In fact, no one was. They were all asking for, could I have an interview? Could I spend an hour? No one was saying, can I come to the Bahamas and spend 2 weeks? So that was, I think no one had asked, and he was reflexively saying yes to media. I think I think there's actually a couple of reasons, though, why it progressed the way it progressed. The story he told himself and the story he told, I think, his colleagues was, we are trying to become the respectable crypto exchange. We are we're trying to be the most regulated, the most licensed. Given what happened, it's ironic, right? We're going to be the most legal. And the holy grail was to get licensed in the United States, either by the SEC or the CFTC, or maybe both. And he thought and told his colleagues that this is a person who writes books that those people read. And so it will maybe smooth things over for us. But the book wasn't going to come out for a year or two, so how useful that was going to be, I don't know. I think the truth is, Sam Bankman-Fried, when he was 12 years old, read Moneyball. And for a brief moment, felt like his way of thinking about the world was validated. He wanted to be a baseball GM for a year. That all of a sudden, it spoke to him. It was music to his ears. And I think he felt a little bit of a connection to me because of that. I think he never said it. The only reason I know any of that is from his dad. He never mentioned he read it. He never mentioned anything about anything I'd ever written. He never asked me any questions about anything I ever did. He never attempted to make that kind of connection, but I think it was there. I think it was there.
Very interesting. Another fascinating thing that you review is how there's very few people before he was 18 that could tell you anything about him, including like his brother.
Is this not odd?
It's remarkable.
If I came to you and I said, Peter, I'm going to write about you, you'd run the other way probably. But if you didn't run the other way and I said, give me a list of people who can just describe you before the age of 18, you'd have a list. Exactly. I have a list. I can give you a list of 20 people who actually knew me quite well in different ways. And naturally going through life, you accumulate this list. You have coaches, you have teachers, you have classmates, you have friends of the family, you have relatives, right? You have that list. He thought about it and he said, all he said was Slim Pickens. And I said, could you give me a name? He said, my parents. And then he gave me his brother. So the parents, of course, they did have something to do with him and they were insightful about him, but very skittish about talking about his childhood. They were very uncomfortable about his childhood.
Was it a recognition that he was so unusual, or why were they skittish?
Well, remember, when I first started talking to them, he's the world's richest person under the age of 30, and they were worried about how this is going to be construed, and they knew how weird it was. And they just didn't want to get into the weirdness. Then you talk to the parents' friends, and they said there was a refrain from them, which I've never really heard of anybody describing a parent's attitude towards their own child. They said they had the sense that the parents were both afraid for and of him, that they had some sense that he didn't quite fit into the world and that they couldn't really steer him, that he was a little unpredictable to them. And that was interesting. But the point is, like, to get to past the parents, the third name he gives me is his brother. I call his brother and his brother says, I didn't know him. He said I was whatever, 4 years younger or whatever it was. He said, and he was a tenant in the house, he never spoke to me. So already, number 3 on the list is of no use. And of course I did the typical thing. I went and found high school classmates and they all said the same thing, that we didn't know him. There was, though, when you started to dig, there were a couple of some social events in his childhood that end up being really important in understanding how he moves through the world socially. One was, he went to math camp when he was like a junior, after his junior year, or maybe after his sophomore year in high school. It's in the book. I can't remember the year. And he discovers a love for puzzles and games and the kind of things that math kids, Rubik's Cubes, but more complicated. And he gets home and he starts to create puzzles for people to solve, like essentially treasure hunts on the Stanford campus, but in order to proceed through the hunt, you have to solve a complicated math problem or a complicated word problem or there's a series of intellectual challenges. It's like a Horcrux hunt. And he broadcasts it on the internet that he's doing these things, and it's like an APB for the nerds of the Bay Area, and it's of every age. And so 100 people will turn up, and this kid, Sam Bankman-Fried, orchestrates the thing. And that relationship to the world, he was, for the first time, I think he's really comfortable. I know I've created a puzzle for you to solve. I'm watching you solve it and helping you solve it. And when I found that, I thought, well, that partly explains how I feel about just him personally. He has created a puzzle out of himself. He wants you to try to figure out him. And he's creating complicated puzzles for prosecutors to solve now. And the other thing that happened in his childhood that was important, and the source of one friendship, but it wasn't really a friendship. It was his partner in a game they played called Magic the Gathering, which is it's the closest thing in kids' games to Wall Street trading, I think. It's a infinitely complicated game in which sometimes the actual best strategies, it's a card game, are unknowable. So it's not like chess, where you can figure out, in theory, the best move. The guy who created the game created it so it was so complicated, the answers were unknowable. And the guy who played the game with him was a friend of his, a child of one of his parents' friends. Ends up being the closest person who has kind of eyes on him and can explain him. But this finding himself in puzzles and games was what happens in his childhood that's important.
Yeah, very interesting. Another point I wanted to raise with you is effective altruism, because his leap to what he became would not have happened but for this guiding philosophy, if you will. Talk a bit about what effective altruism is and why he was drawn to it.
So two things happened to Sam Bankman-Fried when he was a junior at MIT that set him on his course in life. And we can come back to one, high-frequency trading and Jane Street, which is incredibly important. And one of the reasons I was so attracted to this story was what he collided with, I wanted to explain. But effective altruism is a movement that grows out of utilitarianism. And I mean, its origins are in the 19th century England, probably well before that. But in its modern incarnation, 2008, 2009, 2010, a small group of philosophers, young philosophers at Oxford, put forth this idea. They're extending the work of an Australian philosopher named Peter Singer. And Singer had been arguing for decades that people needed to expand their circle of empathy. That they had an obligation or a duty to people outside of their immediate circle. And they should value the life of the person they don't know 5,000 miles away as much as they value the life of the person who's next door to them. And Singer's, the story Singer told, that's sort of like the little anecdote that gets Singer going in the beginning, and that these Oxford philosophers run with, is you're walking by a pond and you see a child drowning in the pond. You have expensive new shoes. You have lovely shoes like your shoes. And you know that going into the pond is going to destroy these $200 shoes. Do you think twice about jumping into the pond to save this child? Of course you don't, even though you don't know the child. So he says Singer, well, why do we even pause before sending, instead of buying the shoes, sending the $200 to save a child in Africa, which $200 would do? Like, it's a pretty good argument. It's like, why don't we? And the fact is we don't. What Peter Singer was doing was divorcing the act of philanthropy and selflessness from actual natural human sympathy and connection and emotion. It was making an argument for philanthropy. And these Oxford philosophers, they actually kind of like say, okay, we're gonna walk this walk. That one of them writes an article saying, I'm gonna give away half of my salary for the rest of my life, and this is gonna be the consequences. And he measures it. He says, look, you can actually measure the number of lives you can save with these dollars. In his case, he said he could save 80,000 children from blindness, but it was over the course of his career. But they get on this jag of actually measuring, being kind of ruthless and rigorous and rational about philanthropic dollars, but coupled with the idea that it's a duty to generate these, to give this money away, even to people you don't know or in theory kind of really particularly care about. The version of this that collides with Sam Bankman-Fried's mind in 2012 is they've taken this argument a kind of an odd step further. They're proselytizing to young, rational, mathy kids at American universities an idea they call earn to give, and it's like we may all agree, everybody in this room, that we are put on this earth to help other people. But when you're thinking about this path, how you help other people, think twice about how people normally think about this. Like, you may be inclined as a scientifically minded mathy person to go to med school and become a doctor. And yeah, you might even go to Africa and save a whole bunch of lives. But if you have the ability to go work for Jane Street or Citadel or one of these high frequency trading firms, and they're gonna pay you a fortune to do it, you could pay for 50 doctors to go to Africa. Now, isn't it more effective? Doesn't the math persuade you that instead of actually doing the good work yourself, that you go and actually just maximize your earnings and then you give it away in an efficient way? And this is an idea that appeals not just to Sam, but his whole circle of friends. Through this, he finds a tribe. And as it turns out, the kind of people who are attracted to this idea, which I think, in my view, kind of starts to jump the shark. It starts to spin out into some other orbit. But the same people who are attracted to these ideas are the people who are being recruited by high frequency trading firms. So Wall Street finds itself around this time surprisingly flooded with kids who are there to make money to give it away. What happens that I think actually biffs Sam Bankman-Fried in the direction he goes and makes his ambitions so grandiose is the Oxford philosophers start to argue when it's all about like the math. How are you going to maximize the number of lives you save with your time on Earth? They start to consider existential risks to humanity, and asteroid strikes and pandemics that wipe everybody out, and AI that wipes everybody out, or climate change, or whatever it is. These risks do exist. It's hard to say you can't say there's zero chance of these things happening. So once you say there's some chance of these things happening, anything you might do to reduce that is certainly going to save more lives you can save just by sending money to Africa now. And so by the time Sam Bankman-Fried is on the road to riches, he's thinking, I'm doing it to reduce existential risk to humanity. To the list of the obvious existential risks, he adds Donald Trump. But otherwise, he's that's how he's thinking. And when that's what is preoccupying you, all of a sudden, the sums of money that you find useful, there's sort of a limit to how much money you can spend usefully saving children in Africa. There's almost no limit to what you can spend trying to prevent pandemics in the future or AI from. You get into government-sized numbers, and so that he and his cohort were thinking like that when they start making money to give it away.
So I do want to linger briefly before we get to Alameda Research and
Right.
FTX on Jane Street.
Yes.
And high frequency trading.
Yes. 2 chapters of the book are about this.
Exactly, that's right. And you worked on Wall Street way back when. Prior to these days, there's no way somebody like Sam Bankman-Fried, would seem anyway, would get a role at Salomon Brothers
It's
or
funny.
Goldman Sachs.
It's funny. I thought this is interesting because if you go back and look at Liar's Poker, it's the beginning of the intellectualization of the financial markets, right? They are pulling the proprietary trading group at Salomon Brothers is for the first time pulling PhDs out of MIT to come trade. But they were so much more socially well-adjusted than Sam Bankman-Fried that they actually passed through social filters. And if they had had Sam's social makeup, they would never have been brought in. And that what happens is the social filters become decreasingly important, that especially as trading gets automated. It's no longer people to person, it's your bot versus my bot. Where Sam goes to work, the Jane Streets of the world really place so little emphasis on social ability that someone like Sam could get in the door. Sam ends up testing even Jane Street's social needs, like he did. They start to become alarmed by how he actually is. But when they're looking for people, they're testing for something very different from what a Salomon Brothers job interview tested for. And they're testing for, and Sam ends up being very good at these tests, they're testing for an ability to think analytically in kind of semi-chaotic environments, like environments like Magic the Gathering, where there's no right answer, but there are better answers you can get to if you're imaginative and analytical at the same time. And he had that combination of imagination and analytical ability that just was catnip to them. And this is an incredibly important part of his story, and an important part of the story of Wall Street. From Sam's point of view, up to the moment, he is identified by not just Jane Street, but other high-frequency trading firms who want to hire him as unusually gifted or filled with potential. No one had identified him as really that special. That he'd been like probably his class, they didn't have a valedictorian, but he would have been his class valedictorian at his small high school in Palo Alto. And he's good at math, good at physics, he was good at playing chess, but he wasn't good compared to people who were really good at that. He was good compared to people who were really good at high frequency trading. And that was the first time he had a sense of himself, first time he had evidence that he was as special as he hoped he was. I think that's what happens at Jane Street. And it becomes extremely important to him, and actually will play out, the effects of that on his identity will play out later. From the Jane Street side, it was so interesting to me. I mean, these places don't let reporters in. I mean, you call them and their lawyer calls you back, or their PR person calls you back, tries to get as much information out of you about what you're doing as they can, and they pretend they'll have you in, and then you never hear from them again. And that's happened to reporter after reporter with them, and I knew it was going to happen to me. Because Sam hired so many people out of this place, he opened a window on the place that I was able to kind of get the story of what it was like in this place. And for me, it was riveting because it was an evolution of financial man thing. And Sam himself said that you could look around the Jane Street trading floor, see a physical difference between the traders of his era, his generation, and the traders of the previous generation, the people who'd founded the firm. People who founded the firm were physically larger because they had to be in pits. Their voices projected. They were more socially capable because they had to be. They tended to be good at like quick math, like mental arithmetic, but higher order analytical thinking. They were not. The doors were being blown off by these new kids coming in who had just intellectual powers that the previous generation didn't have. And Sampson said something very telling. He said you could tell what was going on Wall Street when I arrived just by looking at the average IQ of people at Jane Street versus the average IQ of people at Morgan Stanley. The money they were making, and that was the other thing, is like, when I was at Salomon Brothers, people thought these are obscene sums of money to pay 25-year-olds. But the Jane Streets of the world are paying 25-year-olds 10 times what Salomon Brothers was paying them, even adjusted for inflation. And if you hang and you're really successful for 10 or 15 years, you start to see $50, $60 million. I mean, that's what they told him he was going to make a year. So the sums are incredible. I mean, people used to make millions, and at the top end, maybe 10 million, and now you're talking about billionaires are being made in these places. I mean, and so it is something different happened, and he saw that, and it shaped him. It shaped how he thought about the world.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned already, and certainly go into great detail in the book, is he's not a true believer in crypto. He's not a guy who, most of the people who are reaching out to you to say, write a book about me and what I'm doing and how this is going to change the world, were all in on this. It was their what they lived and they breathed. What got him to go into that business despite not being
it is interesting. It was the crypto people who were forever pitching me to come write about crypto never had a really good story to me about what crypto was for. And it kept changing. First, it was actually going to replace dollars, but you could see pretty quickly that Bitcoin was not, as a means of exchange, was not up to the task of replacing the dollar. I mean, then it was going to be the new gold. And then it was just an uncorrelated asset that, and it wasn't any of those things. Maybe one day it'll be the gold. I don't know. But Sam had none of that story. Sam was, this might be all BS. Like, he always counts everything in terms of probabilities. He said, like 80% chance that this is all BS. 20% chance that it actually finds a use that's going to be great. And the use would naturally probably be disintermediating things, like in theory, eliminate the need for financial intermediaries. And there might be great value in that. But he was not selling that hard. What brings him into it is not that at all. What attracts him to crypto is what actually attracts most people to crypto. It's an excellent gambling tool. I mean, it trades 24/7. There's no barriers to entry. No one asks any questions, and you can run off with your money, and no one knows you have it. It's just like has all these properties that make it very appealing to people who want to speculate. And he was sitting in Jane Street in 2017, and trading conventional assets and watching everybody around him trade conventional assets, trying to get like a 0.1% edge in markets. If you get an arbitrage where you made a whole percent, that was considered like a bonanza. If you could buy Apple stock for 100 and sell it for 101 at the same time, it was like that was a miracle. And he's looking over his right shoulder, and this thing that had been kind of this weird hobbyist interest, crypto, goes from nothing to $1 trillion market. And you can buy a Bitcoin in the United States for $1,000 and sell it for $1,200 at the same time in Japan. Sometimes the ARBs were like 50%. Like, it's outrageous. It looked like it's just like free money to him. And the simple idea was, I'm going to be the Jane Street for crypto. That the high frequency traders had not, for a bunch of reasons. I think everybody was afraid of the legal risk, the reputational risk, and plus it had not been a big market. It had just become a big market. Sam realized there's a window, it's a moment that if I get there fast and I reproduce the Jane Street trading systems, so it's all automated and we're trading making 250,000 trades a day. We send our bots off just to buy things at one place and sell them at another place at different prices that will rake it in. So that was the basic idea. The problem was that he sort of neglected the whole infrastructure that Jane Street gave him. He just took it for granted. So he moves to Berkeley, California, and hires 19 effective altruists, only one of whom had really serious experience in the financial markets, a fellow Jane Streeter. Everybody else had like less than no knowledge. Like they didn't know what a stock or a bond was. They'd never traded anything. They were all 21 and 22, 23 years old. But he used these bodies to try to create a high frequency trading firm for crypto.
Yeah.
And it was, in the beginning, a disaster. It was a disaster in a way that told you what was maybe going to happen later when he got to FTX. There was a great foreshadowing kind of what happened.
The $4 million that was
that
went unaccounted for, and that he wasn't necessarily worried about going and finding it. It'll show up eventually.
Well, it was interesting. So he had these naives with him, people who just didn't know anything and who trusted him in the beginning, and they thought they were all aligned because they weren't making money for themselves, they were making money to give it away. And the capital was all coming from other rich effective altruists. So they had like $175 million of other people's money. Money that in the minds of the people who were using it, these people in Sam's new firm, Alameda Research, could be going to like saving lives. So it's sacred dollars to them. And pretty quickly, it becomes clear to them that Sam is so chaotically disorganized or possibly crooked that the money is at risk. They do very well for 5 or 6 weeks, and then they do very badly for about a month. And at the back end of this month, money had been lost, and not like lost in trades, lost like you lost your keys. Like they just didn't know where the money was. And 30% of the trades they made, there was no record of. And Sam had this new bot he wanted to release on the world that was going to trade even faster, that no one knew what was going to happen when he released it in the world. And he wanted to release it anyway. He was taking these risks that made them all beyond uncomfortable. And there was this split that half the people in the firm quit. But before they quit, they accused him basically of being a criminal. They couldn't tell. They actually, to this day, they don't agree on even now, whether he was basically crooked or basically incredibly sloppy. But what happens, and this shapes the organization that he goes on to create, is that there's an argument about, in particular, $4 million of a cryptocurrency called Ripple that's just gone. And $4 million means a lot to them. And Sam says there's an 80% chance it'll just turn up. Let's just keep trading. Let's not worry about finding it. We will find it or not. The people who left were so upset by his unwillingness to just reckon with this lost money that they flee. But 10 people stay. And right after the 10 who leave, they find the Ripple. And then the thing writes itself and they become very profitable. So the people who stay, including people who become the most important players in FTX, Gary Wang, Nishad Singh, Caroline Ellison, all go through this trial by fire where they may have, if they doubted Sam, they learned not to. That they learned, oh, Sam was right. That all those people who were skeptical of him were wrong. And it's the beginning of, it's probably a case study for startups in that there is this thing that will happen around founders when things bounce their way. They become a little culty, they're cult-like figures. And they were already a cult. There was a cult-like environment. They shared a religion, right? The religion was effective altruism. You can't understand the story if you don't understand. They really believe that. Like whatever you think of it, you have to withhold judgment, right? My description of it is probably not as seductive as the story they told about it in their minds. They cared a lot about this. So they have this already, the preconditions for a cult, shared religious belief. And then they have this figure who has sort of shown that the doubters were wrong. And so it's in that environment from this firm that the crypto exchange FTX is created and is born.
And throughout all of this, the creation of Alameda, the creation of FTX, sort of traditional governance is never put in place. They're not, to say the least, right?
No. So I keep think, people try to take my books and extract business lessons from them. And sometimes there's some lessons. I'm never thinking of the lessons. I'm just thinking with the story. Like, I'm just telling a story and let other people. But I'm trying to figure out what's going to happen with this. And it's sort of like a how not to for a Harvard Business School case study. It's also a bit of, here's why we do the things as we do them, as opposed to just discard all previous management knowledge and theory to try to invent a company from scratch that's completely different from any company that ever existed. So Sam, what does he do? He builds a company. He thinks that he doesn't need a board of directors, so there's never a board of directors. He says there's some guy out there who's called a member of the board of directors because I need someone else to docu-sign the documents. So that he's quite open about this. He's not hiding any of this. It's like arguing for this. No chief financial officer. As he says to me when I ask him, why is there no chief financial officer? He says, everybody tells me I need one. All the venture capitalists say, and I say, what do they do? And they say, the venture capitalists say the CFO keeps track of the money. He says, what do you think I do? I keep track of the money. I don't need a CFO. So he has no CFO. No job, if he had his druthers, 0 job titles. But he hated job titles because he thought they became excuses for people not to do things rather than to do things. Not my job as opposed to my job. And that people used him to inflict status wounds on the people below them. So no organization chart because he didn't want people above and below. To me, this is like it's one of 50 little stories, but that capture the full, not just the spirit of the enterprise, but the chaos created by this man. He gets to an organization of 400 people, and there's no organization chart. There's a lot of unhappiness. And a lot of the unhappiness is it's work drama. And some of that work drama grows out of people not knowing where they are in the structure, or being unhappy with where they think they are, or somebody is not knowing who reports to them or who they report to. It's that kind of chaos. Sam, to deal with the unhappiness, moves his own personal psychiatrist from the Bay Area to the Bahamas, where the business now is. This is about the time I meet him, this fall of 2021. George Lerner is a psychiatrist. Great character. George Lerner gets to the Bahamas and finds, like in a nanosecond, 100 people want to be his patient because they tear their hair out. They're working 20 hours a day and they're unhappy. And he realizes he can't treat them unless he understands how this business works and who's reporting to who. So in therapy, he teases out an organization chart. And it's a beautiful organization chart. Every person is listed on it. But he keeps it secret from everyone because he knows that Sam would be furious if he knew it. But before George disappeared, after it all blew up, he handed me a thumb drive with the org chart, and we put it on the inside of the dust jacket. It was, and I felt like it was like in a Tolstoy novel, you get the family tree. It was that, or a Shakespeare play, you get the kings. It was that. If you wanted to, you kind of need to pin it on the wall as you're reading it, just to see where everybody was. And he did actually figure out a lot about the organization. But the fact that the only reason an org chart exists of this pretty big company is the psychiatrist created it out of therapy is a very Sam Bankman-Fried fact. And that the whole organization is disorganization. And I think Sam had the view that people shouldn't need to be managed. And what that does, maybe in a really small company, you could pull that off. It does sometimes create brilliance. It does sometimes cause people to jump to problems to solve that not their problem. It creates a kind of looseness of structure where people will do great things. But it actually is somehow in violation of human nature too. That people, they need to, if they don't know their place, especially the people he had, These are technologists, half of them from China. The Chinese mind without an organization chart explodes. They just didn't know. It's like the most important thing in the organization is the organization chart. And it created all these human problems. And one of the characteristics of Sam Bankman-Fried is a kind of obliviousness to human problems. I mean, so the business lessons, I'm not sure what it is except that you don't do this. Like, all these things just don't do.
Well, tell me this. You said that some people thought of him as chaotically disorganized and others thought he was crooked.
Yeah.
Where do you come down on that balance between those two?
I think he's not conventionally crooked. He's not like that. He's got a moral infrastructure that's unusual, which will elicit cackles from people who want to think of him as just a simple crook. But he's got no principles. Instead, he's got probabilities. That he thinks of things not in terms like, there's no black and white in Sam Bankman-Fried's world. It's all shades of gray. And so when he thinks about a decision about whether to do this or not do this, he's not thinking, oh, there's a bright red line here and you don't do that. He's thinking, what's the likely outcome from that? And he's aiming towards something that's quite good. He wants to save humanity from extinction. He actually is doing that. It's a bit like, it's like an AI program. It's like an AI program that's been given an instruction, but not been told how to do it. And not given any guardrails about how to do it. So I dial up my Chat GPT 9, whatever in the future, some AI program that's as smart as Sam, and I say, get me a reservation at my favorite restaurant for dinner tomorrow night. That's all I tell it. It goes and finds that my favorite restaurant is fully booked tomorrow night, and it starts murdering people who have reservations to get me a table. That's Sam Bankman-Fried. So now it's not amoral. Is what it is. The other side of him is he learned pretty early in life, and Jane Street sort of reinforces this, that where he excels is in messy environments. If it's too clean an environment, he gets beat. He does not want to play you in chess. He will get beat in chess. But if you say that everybody has to make their move, each move you're only allowed 5 seconds, and once every 5 minutes, you're going to change the rules of the game, then Sam starts to win because everybody else melts down. So he needs to create these environments that are these kind of semi-chaotic environments. Still helps to be smart about chess, but there's something else involved there too then. So he over and over again creates these kind of environments, and he did it with his own business too. And what this does is it creates the preconditions, the chaotic disorganization, the lack of organization, the lack of accounting, the lack of grown-ups creates the situation in which bright red lines can be crossed. You, again, can't understand the story unless you understand this. FTX definitely does not start as like some criminal enterprise. It's such a dumb way to describe what they were doing. They didn't even think they wanted to create an exchange. They had the idea of creating an exchange and they thought they could sell it to Binance or one of the other crypto companies and get a license fee. They didn't think they had the ability to run an exchange. So they certainly didn't go, oh, we're going to create an exchange to like take the customer's money and use it to trade in Alameda. And I don't even think it occurred to them that there was this massive free loan that was accumulating until quite late in the day. But it is also true that they did things that are clearly illegal. I mean, if you just took the story of my book, I leave it to the reader to decide what to think about all this, to render their judgment and get a sense of how it happened. And it leaves you with a sympathy for it because you kind of see how it happened and how he's just different. But if you just take the facts of what they do, just the gross fact that of the $15 billion of customer deposits that were very obviously supposed to be held in cold wallets on the exchange, like 10 of them or maybe more of the billion are inside Alameda functioning as a free loan and nobody knows. That fact alone is just so damning. So when you put the question that way, is it sloppy or is he a crook? The question, the way that you put it, the people who we worked with in the very beginning of Alameda Research put it. And there was a spectrum of answers. There was actually a person who was as cynical as a person could be about Sam Bankman-Fried. And there was actually a person who, though he quit because he couldn't stand the way Sam ran things, actually was quite sympathetic to Sam and thought this person was wrong. And this person was idiotically wrong. I kind of came down closer to this person in that even though they had kind of agreed on the facts, everybody saw what had happened. It wasn't, the disagreement wasn't about the facts. And the disagreement in this story I've written is not about the facts. It's about how you feel about the facts. Like how angry are you about this? Or outraged? Or how sad are you about this? And I tilt towards the sadness thing. If there's a trick to my story, a magic to the book, it's sort of leaving it to the reader to figure out how they feel about this. And there's such a range. I've reproduced in the reading public this drama that occurred in Alameda research with this spectrum, that I have readers who are just outraged beyond belief and thinks he should be lynched, and there are readers who are like, I have people that says things to me that I have not thought, that this is neurodivergence. That's something I've heard. I've heard a lot of that. Like, you can't really blame him because it's how he is. Like, the world should have kind of like constrained this person. It's not like, so there's these like, so I've heard that range of opinion. And I think that's the joy of the story, is it generates that range of opinion. The best stories become like Rorschach tests for the readership, that the reader gets to sort of supply something to it.
Yeah. In the minute or so we have left, I wanted to ask you, you confided in me a while back that you become friendly with a number of your subjects.
Yep.
Obviously, Brad Katsuyama is the starting point of this, exactly. Billy Bean and on.
I've never had one of them leave my life. If I died tomorrow, I think most of them would be at my funeral.
So this is one who might not be at your funeral is Sam Bankman-Fried, and may not be able to go hiking with you in the Berkeley Hills. Is he somebody who you're going to stay in touch with?
He won't be at my funeral because he'll be in jail.
That's what I mean.
Right.
Yes.
That's
exactly what I mean.
But you know what else? This is the other difference. He wouldn't be at my funeral because he wouldn't see he'd make the expected value calculation. He'd say, well, Michael wouldn't care, he's dead, right? It's not worth the emotional gesture would not resonate with him in any way. So he wouldn't be at my funeral in any case. But I will stay in touch with him for sure. Sure. It's been a riveting experience getting to know him, and I still find him endlessly interesting. And I'm always looking for people who are kind of like generating story as they move through life. And I had a glimpse of maybe another story. When the book came out, it came out the day the trial started. But 2 days before it came out, 60 Minutes ran a big piece about it. And I got a note from a person who knew a person who knew a person, letting me know that Sam Bankman-Fried had watched the 60 Minutes episode in jail with his cellmates, the former president of Honduras and the former attorney general of Mexico, and their prison guards. And that afterwards, all the prison guards wanted Sam to give them crypto trading advice. And I just thought, there may be something happening here that I need to pay attention to. because there's a good prison story. If Sam Bankman-Fried ends up being the necromancer inside of the magician inside the jail, I want to be there to see that. So we may stay in touch for literary reasons. But I'm fond of him. It's funny. As is probably true when Brad Katsuyama was asking me for my advice, I tend to conflate my fondness for the person for my excitement about the character. That it's just the character's so much fun just to watch him move through space. He teaches me so much about the world, sometimes inadvertently, that I don't want to lose that. I think he's going to continue to do that. I don't think it's going to stop just because he's in jail.
Well, Michael Lewis, thank you so much for spending time
with
me.
you,
It's
Peter.
always such a great pleasure to speak with you.
Totally fun.